So today we're talking about crisis, crash, and response. So just to remind us of where we were in September of 2008.
This is going to be one of the watershed days in financial markets history.
It was a manic Monday in the financial markets. The Dow tumbled more than 500 points after two pillars of the street tumbled over the weekend. Lehman Brothers, a 158-year-old firm, filed for bankruptcy.
I don't think anyone really expected a bank as big as Lehman to be in a position that it's in now.
Brought down by bad mortgage investments, Lehman, which has 25,000 employees, will be liquidated.
I'm starting to find another job.
Meanwhile, Merrill Lynch, fearing it could be next, agreed in an act of desperation to a shotgun marriage with Bank of America. Merrill, the country's biggest brokerage with 60,000 employees, had been battered by nearly $50 billion in mortgage-related losses.
It is definitely a very, very difficult time, and it's not going to get better quickly.
So in just 6 months, 3 of the 5 biggest independent firms on Wall Street have now disappeared. Bear Stearns, which collapsed last spring, Lehman Brothers, and Merrill Lynch. Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson tried to reassure investors today.
The American people can remain confident in the soundness and the resilience of our financial system.
Paulson attempted to broker a deal to sell Lehman over the weekend, but unlike the buyout deal for Bear Stearns, the government would not offer any financial guarantees.
I never once considered that it was appropriate to put taxpayer money on the line in resolving Lehman Brothers.
It would have required an $85 billion subsidy to keep afloat.
Insurance giant AIG is the next name on the list of troubled companies. It's looking for $40 billion in bridge loans. Veteran trader Art Cashin believes there could be more casualties.
This is the 5th time we've seen this movie. And you sit on the edge of your seat and you yell at whichever character it is, don't go into that woodshed. But they keep going in.
So he was understating things that, of course, at the time, anytime the Treasury of the Secretary comes out on national television to assure you that the financial system is fundamentally sound, you know that people are panicking, and they indeed were. They were speculating at that time the AIG bailout would cost $40 billion. It ended up costing 4 times that. And the crisis just stumbled on. And it was, this is one of many pictures one could, this is just the Dow Jones Industrial Average, and you can see there by the end of September, when banks were failing faster than people could count them. And Hank Paulson, who you saw there, Henry Paulson, he had been the former head of Goldman. And indeed, he had led the group of bankers in the run-up to the financial crisis that I told you about some time ago, who came and petitioned the SEC under the tutelage at that time of Congressman Christopher Cox, arguing that the biggest banks, those with assets in excess of $5 billion, could have relaxed capital requirements because they were so big that they could self-insure. He was by now Secretary of the Treasury. And the reason this turns out to be a significant date is that he had come to Congress on the 29th of September asking for $700 billion to bail out failing banks. And they had come with an extremely brief request for a blank check. And of course, the congressional committees went crazy. And even though the Bush administration had assured them that it was a done deal and Congress would vote it up, they didn't vote it up. They voted it down. And the net effect of that was that the following days, the Dow lost another 700 points, and the catastrophe just kept on going. And of course, it wasn't just the Dow. If you want to get some sense of how rapidly wealth was evaporating, This you can see here from the peak to the trough. Basically, $16.4 trillion in household wealth disappeared. So people were absolutely stunned. They didn't think this could happen. I mentioned to you in an earlier lecture Ben Bernanke's famous speech about the Great Moderation, where he had speculated that the regulators had finally figured out how to tame the business cycle and that things like this were not going to happen again. And just to give you a sense, I should say everybody became sufficiently spooked that 3 days later, Congress did pass a version of the TARP bailout, and with much more regulatory oversight and a promise which turned out not to be worth the paper it was written on, that this wouldn't support institutions that were paying bonuses. We'll hear more about that shortly. So Congress had passed the bailout, and later that month, just to give you a sense of the intellectual shock that was going through the elites, Alan Greenspan, who had been chairman of the Fed until 2006 and had widely been called the maestro and the greatest genius, this is him later in that same month, just 2-3 weeks after Congress had finally adopted the legislation, talking to the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee.
Gentleman will state as unanimous.
Those of us who have looked to the self-interest of lending institutions to protect shareholders' equity, myself especially, are in a state of shocked disbelief. Such counterparty surveillance is a central pillar of our financial market state of balance. If it fails, as occurred this year, market stability is undermined.
You found a flaw in the reality.
A flaw in the model that I perceived is the critical functioning structure that defines how the world works, so to speak.
In other words, you found that your view of the world, your ideology, was not right. It was not working.
Precisely. No, that's precisely the reason I was shocked, because I've been going for 40 years or more with very considerable evidence that it was working exceptionally well.
Where do you think you made a mistake then?
I made a mistake in presuming that the self-interest of organizations, specifically banks and others, was such as that they were best capable of protecting their own shareholders and the equity in the firms.
So there you have it from the maestro himself, confessing how shocked he was. What I want to do today is look at the 2008 and subsequent choices, first in historical perspective, and then we're going to bring to bear some of the instruments that political economists use to talk about regulation in thinking more analytically about the choices. So just to give you a sense of how this was unfolding, of course, this was unfolding over the summer and fall of 2008, when we were in the midst of a presidential campaign, and Barack Obama had been the unlikely winner of the Democratic nomination against Hillary Clinton, and was now doing battle against Senator John McCain, who was the Republican. And during the height of the crisis in September of 2008, when actually John McCain had suspended his campaign, but Obama famously said, well, you need a president who can do more one thing at a time. So he didn't suspend his campaign, but he came to Washington, and here you can hear him opining on the circumstance.
Late this afternoon, I talked to Senator Obama about the bailout and his concerns.
Well, it's not exactly clear. What happened was, when I left Florida, landed, I had heard the news that in fact a deal was there. People are not obviously happy that we got here in the first place, and we shouldn't have gotten here in the first place. It's a consequence of speculator greed, but also Washington not paying attention, and regulators being asleep at the switch. So there's resistance, but there had been at least some core principles that were met. I think that from the Democratic perspective, we just want to make sure that this is helping the small businessman make his payroll, people keeping their money market accounts, that we don't see a cratering of the credit markets that could end up leading to enormous job loss. And obviously, it's pretty frustrating for Democrats, having seen the mismanagement that's been taking place over the last several years, to feel like we've got to step in and get something done. But that's how I think many of us feel, that we can't worry about how we got here. Now we've got to take some serious steps.
We can't worry about how we got here. Now we've got to take some serious steps. And that very much reflected the attitude that Obama and the Obama White House brought to this problem. If you can read all the pop books about the early years of the Obama administration, Too Big to Fail is one excellent one. Ron Susskind's Confidence Men is another. But basically, they assumed that the people who were in the midst of the crisis were the people that knew how to fix it. And I should say right off the bat, they were not wrong about this in many respects, as we will see. But this meant that Obama took on people who had been greatly implicated in the deregulation of Wall Street over the previous decade and a half, people like Larry Summers. And he appointed as his Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner, who often would be attacked in congressional hearings as being in bed with the Wall Street banks and being accused of being a former investment banker. In fact, that wasn't true of Geithner. Geithner had never been a banker. He had always been a bureaucrat. He had been chairman of the New York Fed until Obama appointed him as Secretary of the Treasury. And so Geithner took responsibility for fixing the problem, and he did work very closely with Wall Street. And as a result of this, he very much took this attitude that we shouldn't worry about how we got here. What we've got to do is think about how to get out of it. And Obama bet on him to the extent that produced some considerable grumbling in the administration. And just to give you a sense, the following March, now President Obama out there defending Geithner's efforts, particularly after the huge scandal had erupted that not only was AIG, the insurance giant, being bailed out as I said, some multiple of what had been speculated a few months earlier, but they were paying bonuses to their executives. So the administration was very much back on their heels, and here's President Obama defending Geithner.
With anger mounting over the bonuses awarded to AIG executives, the president is defending his administration's handling of the fiasco.
Nobody here drafted those contracts. Nobody here was responsible for supervising AIG and allowing themselves to put the economy at risk.
AIG paid out $165 million in bonuses last weekend. The federal government has propped up the failed insurance giant with $170 billion in taxpayer money. An angry president says the buck stops with him.
Ultimately, I'm responsible. I'm the president of the United States. Nobody's working harder than this guy. He is making all the right moves in terms of playing a bad hand.
Despite assurances from the president, some have speculated that Geithner's job could be in danger, in part because he couldn't persuade AIG to cancel the payouts.
So there you have it. President Obama had embraced the TARP bailout as a candidate, and indeed, the version of it that had been passed on the 3rd of October in 2008 it was when George W. Bush was still president, had to be passed substantially by Democrats. Most Republicans in the House voted against it. And so the incoming administration was very closely associated with the efforts to bail out the banks and to protect the bankers. And again, just to give you a sense, a week after that, Obama came out onto the White House lawn and defended Geithner. Here you can see him being raked over the coals in a congressional committee hearing.
Just last month, AIG paid 343 employees of AIG FP, their financial products division, or created the financial hole that AIG is in, and in turn, a multi-billion dollar bill for American taxpayers of $56 million in bonuses, and are slated to pay an additional $162 million in bonuses to 393 participants in the coming weeks. And there's more. Further bonus payments totaling approximately $230 million are due to 407 participants at AIG's Financial Products Division in March 2010. This makes no sense to my constituents. This company claims to be on the brink of disaster, and it's handing out bonuses.
I just want to point out that compensation practice across the financial services industry over the last years and decades just got out of whack with basic fundamentals, and people were paid for risks that weren't captured in compensation. And part of what we do to make sure this kind of crisis doesn't happen in the future is to change those basic incentives, and there's going to be a role for government in doing that. Now, it's very important that we make sure that where we're providing exceptional assistance to these firms, that assistance is going, again, to achieve the objectives of these programs, not to reward the kind of executives that got us in this mess. I'm deeply committed to that objective, and we're going to be as careful and responsive as we can to the concerns you have, so many Americans have, about how these resources have been used. And I just want to say that the judgments made by these boards of directors and senior executives across parts of the financial have just caused a lot of damage to public confidence in the quality of their judgment, and they have a deep responsibility and obligation to make more careful judgments going forward, but we're not going to be able to depend on them to do it. We're going to make sure that there's conditions that come with our assistance to assure that. So we're going to figure out how to apply these new provisions in a way that's as carefully designed as possible. Obviously, we want these businesses, we want to achieve the objectives of what we did in AIG. We want them to be able to run their business and restructure so that we're in a better position going forward, and that's why this is sort of hard to do.
So that gives you a flavor of him trying to explain why they had to bail these banks out, even though they were, in this case AIG, even though they were paying these bonuses. And it, in fact, had been a big fight in the White House. Obama had been appalled by it and demanded that they find a way to claw them back. But Geithner and Summers and others said that these are contractual obligations. We have to enforce contracts. We can't renege on them. And in fact, and so that view prevailed. And so this was the zeitgeist, if you like, behind the way in which the Obama administration essentially owned the regulatory response to the crisis in ways that would be costly for them and their successes in ways that they couldn't appreciate at the time. Now, I said I wanted to supply some historical perspective on this response to the crisis. And of course, this is the biggest financial crisis since the Great Depression. So the place to compare it with, or the events with which to compare it, and worth a little bit of reflection, is the response to the Depression. So in 1932, Franklin Roosevelt won the election, and by the time he won the election, in fact, the Hoover administration, people tend to run Hoover and Coolidge together, by the way, big mistake. Hoover was quite a much more enlightened person about macroeconomics, among many other things, than his predecessor had been. And if you read the literature on the Hoover administration, one of the things you learn is that by 1930, 3031, the administration was actually trying to implement much of what FDR would subsequently do. We can't call it Keynesian because the general theory wasn't published until 1936. But essentially, many of the sorts of measures that would subsequently be adopted by the Roosevelt administration were being pushed. American agriculture had been in a recession for over a decade before the crash of the stock market in 1929. They had much higher unemployment through most of this period, topping 20%. And they were looking for ways to spend money and stimulate the economy. And after the election, Hoover begged Roosevelt to do what we just saw Obama doing after the 2008 election, to endorse, in the name of rescuing the American economy, to endorse the proposals that the administration was pushing, which he knew Roosevelt agreed with many of. And Roosevelt flatly refused. He said, this is your government, this is your crisis, you deal with it. And we should also remember that this is in 1932, when the new administration didn't take office until the following March. So we're really talking about a 5-month interregnum during which Roosevelt left the administration essentially twisting in the wind and made it much more difficult for them to implement the sorts of proposals that would have stimulated the economy, or at least what most people, and certainly in the Hoover White House, thought would stimulate the economy. Finally, in March of the following year, Roosevelt came in and passed a lot of what we now think of as the first New Deal. And as I think I said to you when we were talking about welfare states, the early part of the New Deal had a lot of business acquiescence, if not business support, partly because of a fear of communist influence in American trade unions and a worry that American workers might indeed start to conclude that they had nothing to lose but their chains. And so there was some thought among business elites that they should support the New Deal, at least at the beginning. By 1935, that was pretty much over. If you look, the Glass-Steagall Act, which had been passed in 1933, which I'll say a little bit more about shortly, they were already beginning to lobby against it and undermine it. The Wagner Act protecting unions, which was part of the raft of legislation in 1935, immediately drew very hostile reactions from business. And the Social Security Act was also producing lobbying to cut back its implementation, especially in the South. And so there was a real confrontation by 1935 between the Roosevelt administration and business. And far from working with business to try and end the Depression, I'll give you a snippet of FDR's famous Madison Square Garden speech in October of 1936. And I should say this is after the administration, contrary to usual outcomes, had picked up large numbers of seats in the midterm elections in 1934. And so they had big majorities in the House and the Senate. And this is FDR campaigning, speaking in Madison Square Garden in October of 1936 in the run-up to his re-election.
We had to struggle with the old enemies of peace, business and financial monopoly, speculation, reckless banking, class antagonism, sectionalism, war profiteering. they had begun to consider the government of the United States as a mere appendage to their own affairs. And we know now that government by organized money is just as dangerous as government by organized mob. Never before in all our history have these forces been so united against one candidate as they stand today. They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred. I should like to have it said of my first administration that in it the forces of selfishness and of lust for power met their match. I should like to have it said, wait a minute, I should like to have it said of my second administration that in it these forces met their master.
So there you have it. FDR, and he did indeed, he coasted to re-election, again keeping huge, significant majorities on Capitol Hill. And the contrast with the Obama administration is pretty stark. Again, if you go back and read the popular books about the administration, actually the bankers were stunned that more was not demanded of them when they met with various officials from the administration. They were quite taken aback at how little was in fact being demanded of them, and particularly in these areas of executive compensation, which were obviously going to be politically toxic in the way they turned out to be. But before we leave the Great Depression and the Roosevelt administration, it is important to say that contrary to popular belief among many on the American left, actually the New Deal did not end the Depression. The New Deal policies were not particularly effective. And indeed, if you look, there's another big recession in 1938. What really ended the Depression was World War II. The war economy ended the Depression, is now today the pretty widespread consensus among historians. So even though politically, of course, what FDR did was absolutely brilliant, it's not clear how effective the New Deal was in dealing with the Depression. That's not to say it wasn't desirable policy for longer-term reasons to build a social safety net and a welfare state, but it was not the Roosevelt administration did not have any policies that worked particularly to end the Depression. And indeed, if you were a hard-boiled Keynesian, he was quite haphazard. He had two brains trusts, one in Columbia that was much more what we would think of as proto-Keynesians, and then hard money people in Harvard giving him conflicting advice, and he was something of a push-me-pull-you. And he was, in 1938, they reduced spending. So it's not as if they had the keys to the policy solutions. And from that point of view, if you could say that the Roosevelt response to the Depression was perhaps brilliant politics and important for the longer run, but was not a particularly effective solution to the Depression. Maybe nothing would have been, but certainly what they did wasn't. So let's now come back to 2008 and the response. And there were several pieces to the response. The first is the Fed. under the direction of Geithner and others, really did, they stopped the US and global liquidity meltdown. I underlined global on that slide in deference to Adam Tooze's excellent book, Crash, published about a year and a half ago, in which he documents to a degree that had not been fully appreciated before how much the Fed not only bailed out the US economy, but created global liquidity over a period of a number of years in Europe, in Asia in particular. Trillions and trillions of dollars of liquidity was created partly because the Europeans found themselves unable to do it. The one important takeaway from the financial crisis is that in one respect, a lot of mantras about globalization and transnational institutions and so on turned out to be vastly exaggerated, in that the international financial institutions did not have a very big role in fighting the financial crisis. And in Europe, the European Central Bank couldn't coordinate on policies. This is basically Tooze's story. And so it fell to the Fed, that could act as a unitary actor, to essentially create and maintain global liquidity until the crisis finally subsided. And so as a technical matter, preventing this Great Recession from turning into a Great Depression, a lot of the credit does indeed belong to the Fed. And the truth is that the real financial crisis in the US system was 3 or 4 days, when it really looked like the whole thing might go to pieces. Then there were a lot of chronic problems and subsequent aftershocks and so on. But the fact is that the Fed took actions that nobody could have contemplated taking if there had been anybody to take them during the Great Depression. Then the second piece of the response was the piece of legislation called the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act, better known as the TARP 700 billion, that was finally enacted, as I told you, at the beginning of October in 2008. And that was largely for bailing out insolvent institutions for which mergers could not be arranged, or sweetening the pot in order to facilitate mergers of financial institutions that otherwise would have gone bankrupt. Then the next big piece of the response was the Obama stimulus, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, so-called, which started out being priced at $787 billion, but ended up costing more like $830 billion. And that was stimulus money, Keynesian stimulus money, to try and get the economy going. And then, of course, the last piece of the response was financial services reform. The Dodd-Frank law, Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, passed in July of 2010. We will not be able to dig into all of this in today's lecture. And the central question I want to talk about, which fits us into the arc of the course, is what do these responses to the crisis reveal? What could have been done differently, if anything? And what were the downstream effects of the way, in fact, they did respond? But first, I want to introduce some concepts from political science and political economy, and use them as, if you like, lenses for thinking about regulation and regulatory reform. This is a course, after all, in which we're trying to keep political science honest by bringing history to bear, but also using the analytical insights of political science to think about historical developments. So I want to talk about the three main perspectives on regulation, and then we'll take a closer look, particularly at the Dodd-Frank legislation, from the point of view of these. So the first, which I'm calling technocratic regulation, really goes back to Peugeot's economics of welfare. He was one of the most famous welfare economists of the early 20th century, and this is when welfare economics was thought of as an explicitly normative enterprise. If you open the economics of welfare and start reading it, the first few paragraphs are all about how to organize the economy for improving the national welfare. And a lot of Peugeot's work was about regulation, and there's a certain innocence to the whole tone of that book, in that he assumes that there are right answers to regulatory conundrums, whether or not to regulate and how to regulate, and that they can be implemented by somebody called a legislator. And indeed, a lot of the early economics work, if you go back, read papers from that era, when they talk about regulation, they will, in their models, there'll be a legislator who's going to do this or not do this, that, and the other. And so the idea is that there are certain kinds of situations where the economist technician can figure out that there's definitely a problem in the market system, and the regulation can fix it. And indeed, there are some examples of regulation where it's pretty clear what the technocratic answer, in fact, is. So one very interesting example in American history is that we used to have heavily regulated airlines, and the federal government justified this on the grounds that it was interstate commerce, right? Planes fly across state lines. But there was a lot of suspicion that these regulations were mostly serving the interests of the airlines. And then a number of academics had the brilliant idea they found what we might call a natural experiment, which was that there are two states that are sufficiently large, Texas and California, that they have big airline routes that don't cross state lines, and so therefore were exempt from the FAA's regulations. And they did a bunch of empirical studies which showed that the airlines operating only within Texas and California were way cheaper and way more efficient than the regulated ones. And so it was a kind of lay-down hand demonstration that we shouldn't be regulating these industries, at least in the way we were, and whatever benefits they were serving, they were not serving the interests of the consumer. And these studies provided a considerable amount of the ballast in arguing for airline deregulation and turning airplanes into, instead of playthings for the wealthy, sort of buses with wings, which is what we have today. Other areas where technocratic regulation gives you the right answer is where there are unambiguous market failures. For example, insurance markets. If you do not require people to have collision insurance, the problem is that the people who would go and want to go and buy collision insurance are the risky drivers with no assets. And they're the people that insurance companies would not want to insure. So if you're a very safe driver and you can self-insure, you wouldn't want to do that. And so if it weren't mandatory for people to buy auto insurance, insurance markets would end up pricing it so high that most people wouldn't buy it, and the markets would unravel. So this is the idea. It's what sometimes called adverse selection by economists. You have adverse selection means that the people the companies don't want to insure are the ones who want the insurance, and the people that they would want to insure don't want it, and they're certainly not going to buy it at the price that the companies are going to charge. Similar arguments get made about health insurance, that only sick people would go and buy health insurance voluntarily, and so that would price, the market would price it out of the reach of most people. So these are the sorts of areas where you have unambiguous market failures because of adverse selection, and as a result, there's a case, technocratic case for regulation. Another is depositors' insurance in banks. So if you think about how banks make their money, people in an era when banks paid interest, of course, people would deposit their money in the bank and get paid a certain interest rate. The bank would then lend out the money to people who were investing things, and the bank would make its money on the spread, right? I'm not talking about a badly managed bank. I'm talking a completely well-functioning bank. That's what banks do. That's what they're there for, right? But of course, it all assumes that not everybody's going to come along and take out their money at once, because they don't have the money. They've lent the money, right? So that is what a well-functioning bank does. Now, if you have a panic, and this is what happened during the Depression, if you have a panic, and people start to believe that the bank is going to go bankrupt, then everybody's going to go and take their money out of the bank because they don't want to lose their money, right? And so you're going to get a run on the banks, right? And this is part of among the things that happened during the Depression. And indeed, part of it, we think of Glass-Steagall for other reasons, but the financial reforms of 1933, one of the things they did was create depositors' insurance, right? Because then if everybody's told no, if the bank goes bankrupt, you're going to be covered up to, it was until the financial crisis, up to $100,000, then people, they know the government's going to protect them and they'll leave their money in the bank, and you won't get the bank run. Again, so there's a clear technocratic case here for regulation, right? These are not hard calls, one might say. Though I would add that notice sometimes the technocratic solution creates new problems. So if the government is insuring depositors, then it means the banks can gamble with other people's money, because the government knows that the bank knows the government's going to bail out their depositors. They are not going to go bankrupt, and so they can be more risk embracing than they might otherwise be. And so you might think that then they have to regulate them. The way, in fact, that was handled when they created the FDIC was they made the banks finance the bailout funds. So the banks had to essentially, pay a tax that funded the insurance of depositors, so that the banks are internalizing the risk, if you like, of providing it. Though, as it turned out, during the financial crisis, it rapidly became obvious that 100,000 wasn't going to be enough to stop runs on banks, and so the government in the middle of the crisis just increased it to 250,000, which, among other things, made it obvious that if push comes to shove, actually the taxpayers are insuring the deposits. So it doesn't solve, if you like, the moral hazard that the banks have to be risky if they now know that even if the deposit insurance is insufficient, Uncle Sam will come to the rescue. So when we think about, even if it's an unambiguous case for regulation, doesn't mean that there's a solution that's not going to generate tricky problems of its own. There are also hard cases. So if you imagine yourself to be a senator or a congressman or a congresswoman sitting in a hearing, and in walks Paul Volcker, former Fed chair, extremely distinguished economist, and says we've got to separate commercial from investment banks. We cannot have investment banks investing their own money while also being fiduciaries for people who deposit funds. This has been what had been done in Glass-Steagall and had been undone in the run-up to the financial crisis, and Volcker was firmly of the view that some version of this needed to be reinstituted so that the investment banks would not end up having the sort of incentives that, for example, Goldman turned out to have during the housing crisis, which I will talk about on Thursday, when they unloaded mortgages that they knew were going south on their own clients. Conflict of interest between their fiduciary obligation to their clients and their attempt to protect their balance sheets as investors. So you have Volcker coming in saying this has got to be stopped. And then you have Tim Geithner, the genius from the administration who saved the world economy, coming in saying, this is a terrible idea, we should not do this. It interrupts the way in which markets work, because investment banks often have to do market making. They have to facilitate transactions, which sometimes means buying and holding assets from somebody who wants to sell them until you can find a buyer. And he'll give a long speech about why, in fact, we shouldn't have what subsequently came to be known as the Volcker Rule. And you're the senator sitting there, or the congressman or the congresswoman. Do you think these politicians have the slightest idea who's right? They have absolutely no idea who's right? And you could line up distinguished economists on both sides of this question, and the politicians are going to have to decide what to do. But in fact, these are technocratic hard calls that often elude the people who are actually making the law. And then there's, in addition, even if you have a good technocratic regulation, will the government actually have the capacity to implement it? Again, if you think back to, as I said, in 2004 and 2005, when the big banks persuaded the federal government to ease up on their capital requirements, they said, in return, we'll open our books to you. But in fact, Christopher Cox had, I think it was 4 or 5 regulators, or maybe 6, whose job was to watch more than $4 trillion in assets, and they simply didn't have the capacity to do it. So while it is true that there are sometimes clear cases for regulation on technical grounds, we shouldn't think you can wring the politics out of it, or that the process of implementing it doesn't create issues that subsequently will come home to roost in difficult ways. But I think if you wanted the poster child for a technocratic regulator, it would be Tim Geithner. And just to give a sense of this, here he is 5 years after the fact, ruminating on the actions that he took.
I think a lot of people still feel that the banks should have been made to pay in some way, either in terms of restructuring, less executive compensation. In some cases, some people should have gone to jail.
I think everybody feels that way.
Do you feel that way?
Well, I feel like it's a complicated thing. There was a terrible amount of abuse and fraud and bad behavior and damaging and dumb things that people did in this crisis. And I think Americans definitely deserved a stronger enforcement response.
Yeah,
and
but I want to know what you think. I mean,
and I think
you saw this up close better than anybody. Does it surprise you nobody went to jail?
It doesn't surprise me no one went to jail. It doesn't surprise me.
What may have been immoral or unethical, he says, was not illegal. Geithner would become a lightning rod, and TARP, the $700 billion rescue package he helped push through to save the banks, would take much of the heat. Banks have paid back the loans with interest, but the cheap money they were lent allowed them to reap billions in profits as homeowners struggled.
these banks were still taking huge bonuses.
Oh, it was terrible. That was terrible. It was outrageous and killed us.
But Geithner argues that even though it appeared the arsonists were being rewarded, the banking system had to be secured.
In a financial panic, there is enormous collateral damage. They're deeply unfair and tragic in that context. So the first imperative is to make sure you make the system stable, not because you care about the banks or you want to protect them from their mistakes, but because if you let the lights go out, the system will collapse around them.
Do you worry about defending your legacy?
I feel very confident that we made some very good choices and the best choices we could in the circumstances at the time.
So, you know, there you have it's not that he thinks these people were good or that they didn't do terrible things, but that's not his job. His job was to save the system, and this was the way to do it. So the short of it is that technocratic theories of regulations ignore the ways in which power, politics, and ideology shape outcomes. So a second perspective on regulation goes back to a Chicago economist by the name of George Stigler, not to be confused with Stiglitz, who is a famous economist writing today. And Stigler pays attention in his work, and this is hugely influential, to the distribution of power in the economy. And he says, well, what is a regulation? A regulation is actually a valuable thing, and so it's going to have a price. He thinks like an economist. And what a regulation is basically the capacity to use the government's monopoly on power to get something. And powerful groups are going to use it if the government is available. So even though he's a Chicago economist, generally thought to be heavily pro-market, basically what is his theory of regulation is that big firms, producer interests, are going to dominate what regulations get made. Big firms are going to use terminology we've used earlier in the course, the big firms in an industry have a K group. They can coordinate in order to get the regulations that they want adopted by politicians. They can coordinate, they can lobby for them, they can spend money to get them, and that's what they will do. Whereas for small firms and consumers, it's very hard for them to organize, and it's going to be unlikely that they're going to get their way. As a causal matter, we should expect the big firms to dominate the regulatory process. In Stigler's mind, this is a reason for avoiding regulation altogether, which is something, is one inference one could draw from it, but there are others which we'll get to in a minute. So if you want examples of this, it would be airline regulation in the first place, right? It served the big airlines to get these regulations to protect their markets, and so they regulated to get them. Taxi medallions in New York City. Before the advent of Uber, a New York City taxi medallion was worth $1 million. Today it's not even worth $100,000. Right? Again, you essentially, until the changes in the market eroded the monopoly that the taxi medallions had created, they functioned as huge barriers to entry. And indeed, in many European countries, there's still big fights that in Madrid, for example, Uber is outlawed. Again, you have a taxi monopoly protecting itself. Also, I mentioned to you earlier the erosion of Glass-Steagall. So Glass-Steagall's passed in 1933. If you read Ron Chernow's The House of Morgan, one of his many brilliant books, among the themes that Chernow recounts in that book is the relentless efforts to to get rid of Glass-Steagall almost from the moment that it was enacted. And the truth be told, when it was finally repealed in 1999, at the end of the Clinton administration, there was virtually nothing left of it. So again, the big financial institutions had used their lobbying power to get regulations that served their own interests. So very different than the technocratic theory of regulation. Here the argument is the big players shape the regulatory landscape, and if you want to know how it's going to play out, look at what their interests are, because they're the ones who are going to prevail. A third perspective on regulation takes off from the observation, well, politicians need money, but they also need votes. And so they're going to have to trade off attending to lobbyists and attending to voters. The two most important pieces here by Samuel Peltzman from the 1970s, and a more recent one prompted by Doug Frank, by a Columbia economist by the name of John Coffey. And so the idea here is that politicians can't completely ignore voters, but so when will they attend to voters? Because the thing about voters' sentiment is that it's sometimes intense, but it's very intermittent. Voters get outraged by something and focus on it for a short time, but then, things change. There's something else in the headlines, and it moves on. So Coffey called it a kind of sine curve of regulation. So when voter anger is at a high fever pitch, you might be able to, or concern is at a fever pitch, you might be able to enact a regulation that you will not be able to enact at a different time. And most of the time, consumer interests are latent, but they'll become manifest. But of course, if the producer groups, the big players, the Stigler people, know that, their motto just needs to be, all we have to do is wait, right? And so the examples that immediately come to mind are, gun control legislation. Every time there's a school shooting, there's this, whipped up rage by voters that something has to be done, and politicians all say something has to be done, but the NRA keeps its head down, and a few weeks later, the news cycle has moved on, and you come down the sine curve, and you don't need to pay attention to voter interests. Support for disaster relief is the same kind of thing. In the midst of a disaster, there'll be huge pressure to support spending money for disaster relief. But once the disaster or the headlines about the disaster are over, the support dissipates. This is why Amartya Sen makes the point that you don't get famines in democracies. That's true, but you do get chronic poverty, right? So, because crises generate voter interest and attention, whereas chronic problems tend not to. This is the voter-orientated model that's going to tell you politics and ideology are going to matter some of the time, but much of the time you're going to, in fact, have the big producer groups get what they want regardless of the politics and regardless of the technocratic merits. So if you think about Dodd-Frank, it was a major overhaul of banking regulation in the US, of capital requirements, how much capital banks have to hold, and of the government's resolution authority, what power the government has to unwind troubled banks. A few things to say about it. First of all, it was enacted in the spring and summer of 2010, before the midterms. And that meant actually they enacted it even before the commission that they had appointed to analyze what had gone wrong in the financial crisis had reported. And the reason they did that was that, unlike 1934, the vast majority of the time, the party in the White House loses seats in the midterm elections. They didn't know they would actually lose control, but they knew they're going to be less well placed to pass legislation after the 2010 midterms. So the whole thing had to be concertinaed into a very short period of time. This was not a bill Republicans were going to support, and they knew it. The White House knew it, and so they essentially had to do what they had to write this bill in over the course of 2010 and get it enacted in the summer of that year, which is what they did. It was subject to intense lobbying before, during, and after passage, but it illustrates all three of the models that I've been talking about, and you can see how the different ones give you insight into different aspects. So one of the nice things about this book by Alan Blinder, who had been on the Federal Reserve as an economist at Princeton, is that he has a 4-page table in this book after the music stopped, which summarizes the whole bill. And I'm not going to go through all of it, but on the left column is the issue, and then the key aspects of what the debate were, then the Treasury proposal, and then what was finally enacted. And the point is that the Treasury proposal very much reflected the interests of the industry, because the industry had lobbied the Treasury very heavily. And the takeaway from the chart, I'll post all 4 pages of it for you to look at, is that on virtually everything of importance, the Treasury got what it wanted. Essentially what the Treasury had negotiated with the banks was what wound up in the law on the too big to fail, on systemic risk, on various other things. And as I said, I will post these so that people can look through them. But on virtually all particulars, the Treasury got what it wanted, signaling the Stiglerian theory looked pretty good. When President Obama signed it in July, the industry was unhappy with some pieces of it. They had essentially lobbied to stop the bill for as long as they could, and then to weaken it once they saw a bill was definitely going to pass. And Scott Talbot, the chief lobbyist for the Financial Services Roundtable, the day the bill was signed, he said, "This is halftime." And so where did they fail? Where did the industry not get what it wanted? So one issue was the issue of proprietary trading I've already talked about, the so-called Volcker rule. And what was interesting about how they wound up with the Volcker rule was the following. They had lobbied to kill it, and they had killed it. And you might remember that in 2008-9, Senator Kennedy from Massachusetts died. And this was at a time when there was increasing anger in the grassroots of the Democratic Party with the degree to which the Obama administration was being solicitous of the banks and had let the AIG bailouts go, and so on. And so there was a special election in Massachusetts, the most liberal state in the Union, often said to be. Was it Ronald Reagan who called it the People's Republic of Massachusetts? So it's some conservative politician called it the People's Republic of Massachusetts. Anyway, shock. The Democrats were so dispirited there was very low turnout, and a truck driver, since come and gone, actually won the Senate seat. And Obama was so the pop books say, was sufficiently spooked by this that they decided they had to do something for the base of the Democratic Party, and they put the Volcker rule back in, essentially outlawing proprietary trading. And so that's how it wound up in the bill. The other area where the industry didn't prevail was in the consumer protection area. There, the feeling was sufficiently strong in the White House that that predatory lending had to be stopped. This was Elizabeth Warren, who was, by the way, was in the White House in 2009 and 10, and this was the central thing she had been pushing, and it was non-negotiable. There was going to have to be consumer financial protection. The industry hated it. They lobbied and lobbied and lobbied to stop it, and when they couldn't stop it, they essentially they worked with the folks from the Treasury to create an administrative structure that was almost completely unworkable. Alan Blinder, in his book, and he's certainly no flaming radical, describes it as a Rube Goldberg machine, and it was not given cabinet status. It was contained within the Treasury. It reported to Congress. The first few years of its operation produced huge turnover of personnel because they were so demoralized. So there you see the interplay between the Stigler and the Peltzman Coffee views. In fact, the lobbying was just incredible. And one of the interesting things is more than $1 billion was spent, but one of the interesting things is you can see on this chart here is that much of the lobbying occurred after the bill passed. So the bill passes here, right? And you can see the financial lobbying against of the Fed, the Treasury, and other regulatory organizations actually increases. Here's a New York Times breakdown of money spent lobbying after the passage of the legislation. Now you might think, well, why? You know, isn't it game over once the legislation has been passed? And actually not. For example, on the Dodd-Frank law, I happened to be friends with somebody who at that time was a partner at Goldman. And the day the bill passed, I said to him, so does this mean Goldman is out of the proprietary trading business for good? He said, it'll be 5 years before it's clear whether we manage to kill that or not. And so what you look at is, you know, when Congress passes a law, that's just the beginning. Then they have to, the regulators have to write rules. And this is where a lot of the lobbying actually occurs, partly because of the coffee curve of regulation. Voters are on to the next thing now. Nobody's thinking about Dodd-Frank. Nobody's thinking about the Volcker rule. And so they publish a potential regulation. You have a comment period. They got 8,000, the vast majority, long, detailed comments from the industry. Financial lobbying groups met with regulators 400 times, 78%, almost 80% of all the meetings they had. The rule they had to keep pushing back the rule because they couldn't get it written. And so the second time they had another comment period, they got 17,000 comments. Again, the vast majority of them from the industry, proposing amendments that would essentially make the rule unadministrable. Particularly would make it virtually impossible for a regulator to tell the difference between genuine market making, where a bank buys and holds some assets that a client wants to sell in order to find another buyer, from when they're buying them for their own purposes and on their own account. And it finally is partly repealed for smaller institutions in the Trump reforms of 2018. And just to come full circle on the Stiglerian theory, once Trump came into office, you know, the Republicans had been campaigning for years on repeal Dodd-Frank. It's this terrible thing the Obama administration has put in. But you would start to see articles like this one in the Wall Street Journal. Guess who's defending Dodd-Frank? they said. This is December 2016, a month after Trump's election. There, the Wall Street Journal op-ed page says, there goes another liberal fantasy. In progressive law, giant banks hate Dodd-Frank and would like nothing more than to return it to a regulatory Wild West. So why has it been so hard since the Republican election sweep to find a Wall Street CEO who favors repealing Dodd-Frank? J.P. Morgan's Jamie Dimon, Lloyd Blankfein of Goldman have urged against repeal, and other bank CEOs are suggesting policy small ball rather than wholesale reform. Blankfein, who will have former colleagues as senior policymakers in the Trump administration, in particular, is in a position to encourage significant change. But last year, this is Blankfein, explained why that's not in Goldman's interest. After describing how regulatory costs have helped raise the barriers to entry in his business higher than at any time in modern history, Blankfein forecast more opportunities for global giants like Goldman to gain market share, as only a handful of players will be able to effectively to compete on a global basis. So this is the Stigler theory, up in lights, that the Dodd-Frank has now become a massive barrier to entry for smaller firms. Likewise, the much hated, much despised, much criticized Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Last week, the journal went on. The presidents of 4 trade associations representing banks and credit unions also urged deregulatory restraint and pushed for very minor reforms. So when we think about the missed opportunities, what could have been done differently? To some extent, and you get this from the popular books, the Obama administration came in there and was sort of drinking out of a fire hydrant. Things were happening so fast, they really had very little choice. To some extent, they were a victim of weak parties. This is something I'm going to talk much more about in the remaining lectures of the course. But one difference, if you think back to the 1930s, the parties were much stronger, and in 32 and 34, the Democrats were in a very different position to enact FDR's reforms than was the case in the response to the financial crisis, where I told you the Bush administration had to work with congressional Democrats to get TARP enacted, and the Obama administration knew that it had a tiny window of opportunity, and it was not going to be able to do very much. And by the way, the Trump administration ran into the same thing when they sought to repeal much of Dodd-Frank. They ran into massive resistance to repeal in the Senate, perhaps from senators who were being supported by some of the people that were being talked about in the Wall Street Journal op-ed piece I was talking about. But I want to end by just talking about elite complacency. I showed you this picture at the beginning of today's lecture of the collapse of the stock market and the vanishing of $16.4 trillion of net worth. But what I didn't say is, if you look, what was the case 2 years later? 2 years later, more than half of the wealth had already come back. And if you look at the financial sector, if you look at the stock markets, this is France, Germany, Japan, UK, and the US in light blue. You can see that a decade after the collapse, the stock markets had all come back, and indeed, I believe we had a record high on the Dow yesterday. So from the point of view of people in the financial services industry or upper middle class people, their 401ks had come back. For them, this crisis was long over for many such people. And I think that what that ignored was the increasing divergence between that recovery for people in the financial services sector with significant retirement assets and other assets in stock markets, and the real economy that was playing itself out. in Middle America and over much of Europe, where you can see that the jobs deficit was much deeper after this crisis and lasted a lot longer. You can see that long-term unemployment, that is people who are unemployed for more than 27 continuous weeks, was at higher levels, and today, to this day, remains at higher levels than for more than half a century. Housing, more than 10 million houses would be foreclosed upon in the decade following the housing market, which is the subject I'm going to talk about next. But this divergence between the fortunes of people living off the financial economy and the rest of America, and by the way, it's not only America, this is the Angela Merkel welcoming refugees into Germany, also greatly underestimating the angst out there, outside of the political and economic elites. And that angst is what would be coming back to bite in 2016. Okay, we will talk about the housing crisis on Thursday.